You probably think Vikings were all about glory, honor, and mead-soaked feasts, like some half-drunk blend of Marvel's Thor and Assassin's Creed. But here's a darker truth. When Viking warbands celebrated victory, the real horror often began after the feast ended. Forget the romanticized image of shield maidens and noble warriors. Imagine this instead: a captured bride dragged into a smoky hall while men chant her husband's name, a husband who was just killed hours earlier. What happens next makes modern war crimes look almost restrained. Here's the part you've never heard in school. Viking marriage wasn't about romance. It was about power, humiliation, and control. A war bride could be forced into grotesque public rituals that blurred the line between wedding ceremony and torture chamber. And it didn't stop at one night. For some women, captivity meant years of being traded, displayed, or even sacrificed. Across sagas, chronicles, and archaeological finds, the trail is there, but piecing it together reveals a system more depraved than you can imagine. And tonight we're diving into 7 escalating levels of Viking bride horror. By the end, you'll never see those horned helmets the same way again. And yes, what the Vikings did makes modern dating apps look like a church service. The battle is over. Smoke still rises from burned thatch, and the bodies of the fallen are cooling in the mud. For the victors, there is no solemn silence, no reverence for the dead. Only the clamor of celebration. Inside the mead hall, torches crackle, horns are lifted, and drunken roars echo against wooden beams polished by centuries of spilled ale and blood. This is not just a party, it is a ritual of power, and at its center, hidden beneath the noise, lies the real horror. The Vikings are remembered for their feasts as much as their battles: endless drinking, mountains of roasted meat, boasts shouted until voices broke. To the modern imagination, it sounds almost like a medieval frat party with fur cloaks. But behind the laughter was a system of cruelty. For when the warriors drank to victory, the spoils of that victory were not only silver, weapons, or cattle, they were human beings. Captured women were marched into these halls as living trophies. Imagine it. Their villages just destroyed, their families slaughtered, their futures stolen. And now, they were forced to watch as their captors toasted their new brides, not with flowers, not with vows, but with jeers, slaps, and the clinking of mead horns. In Viking culture, the sharing of plunder was a sacred duty. Loot bound a warband together. It ensured loyalty, which meant that women, taken as part of that loot, became bargaining chips in the drunken economy of the feast. Some were given as rewards to the fiercest fighters. Others were traded between men as casually as you might swap a piece of jewelry. The bride was not chosen, she was assigned. And here's the part that shatters every romantic image of Viking culture. The so-called gift of a woman was often done publicly in front of the entire hall. A warlord would rise, slamming his horn on the table, declaring that this man had earned not only land or treasure, but a living bride, the woman herself. Her screams or silence meant nothing. She was displayed like a prize animal at an auction. It is a grotesque inversion of marriage. Where modern weddings celebrate consent and union, Viking feasts turned the ritual into humiliation and ownership. The woman did not walk down an aisle. She was dragged across a smoky floor, thrown at the feet of a drunken man, and claimed before the eyes of his comrades. To us, it seems unimaginable, but within that culture, it was normalized. The sagas and chronicles record these feasts with casual detail, as if no explanation was needed. Women were part of the plunder, no different from cattle or swords. And just like cattle, they were distributed to prove the generosity of the leader and the loyalty of the men. Pause for a moment and think. Imagine being that woman. Hours ago, you were a wife, a daughter, a sister. Now, in a single night, you are property, your humanity reduced to the laughter of drunken strangers. It is humiliation elevated into ritual, and it tells us something chilling for the Vikings. War was not just about killing enemies. It was about breaking them so completely that even their wives and daughters became symbols of conquest. Modern parallels are hard to ignore. Think of how, even today, victorious athletes or businessmen are handed prizes, trophies, or women on the arms of advertisements, as if success entitles men to bodies. The Viking feast was this logic pushed to its most brutal extreme. But here's the darkest irony. For the men, this grotesque gift-giving wasn't only celebration, it was proof of order. The feast wasn't chaos, it was hierarchy written in flesh. Leaders displayed their dominance not only through gold, but through their ability to command life and death, to take what others held most sacred, their families, and turn them into drinking games. The hall would roar with laughter, with boasts of future raids, with the sound of mead spilling onto the floor. But beneath the noise lingered the muffled sobs of women who had just lost everything. And the feast was only the beginning. Because after the laughter faded and the horns ran dry, the real nightmare would begin. The drunken gift was not the end of her humiliation. It was the opening act. And what came next makes the feast look almost merciful. It begins with a silence more suffocating than any scream. A line of women, disheveled, bruised, their wrists bound, stand beneath the smoky beams of a Viking hall or the open air of a bustling camp. They are not warriors, they are not allies, they are merchandise. To the Vikings, war booty was not complete until it had a face, until living, breathing people were added to the ledger alongside silver and swords. And in this twisted economy, women became the highest currency of all. Imagine the scene. Men drunk on victory strut between these captives, tugging at hair, prying open mouths, groping limbs as if inspecting livestock. And that is exactly what it was. These women weren't introduced as brides. They were displayed like animals at a market. The sagas and foreign chroniclers do not soften the language. One Arab traveler, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, described how Viking traders treated enslaved women, stripped, handled, and paraded for potential buyers. Their value depended on beauty, fertility, and obedience, the same qualities prized in cattle. The grotesque irony is inescapable. The culture that celebrated its gods with rituals of honor reduced human beings to bargaining chips in drunken haggling sessions. To be chosen meant survival, though survival came at a devastating cost. To be overlooked often meant worse: abandonment, degradation, or death. And here's the cruelest twist. Sometimes these so-called brides were exchanged not just for silver, but for jokes, favors, or wagers lost in gambling. One man's wife for another man's oath. A human life bartered for a drinking debt. Picture a medieval auctioneer, but instead of antiques or art, the prize is a terrified woman whose dignity has already been stripped away. If this sounds exaggerated, remember, the Norse legal codes and sagas openly documented the practice. The word bride itself, in their world, carried echoes of transaction. Marriage was less romance than contract, less union than ownership. The marketplace was not hidden. It was public, ritualized, and even celebrated as part of Viking identity. Think of the hypocrisy. Viking culture loved to boast of honor and kinship, yet kinship was torn apart the moment another clan fell. Honor was defined not by protecting the weak, but by how convincingly you could display your dominance over them. The market was the ultimate theater of this dominance, an arena where men measured power by how many bodies they could claim. The disgust is hard to shake. You can almost hear the jeers as bids are shouted, the clinking of silver, the laughter of men who saw themselves as warriors of destiny, while women wept silently in the background. It feels obscene, like watching a carnival of cruelty dressed up as tradition. And disturbingly, there are echoes that carry forward to today. Think of human trafficking rings that still operate in shadows, selling women across borders, treating their pain as profit. The Viking bride market was not an outlier of barbaric times. It was an early, open-air version of a crime that still thrives in our own world. The only difference, back then, it wasn't secret. It was celebrated. The sagas even tell us that warriors sometimes bragged not about the silver they brought home, but about the women they collected. To claim a bride was to prove your masculinity, your loyalty, your right to stand among men, which meant every transaction was more than cruelty. It was performance, a performance designed to strip women of humanity while inflating the egos of those who enslaved them. And here lies the darkest irony of all. To the Vikings, giving away a woman was an act of generosity. Leaders cemented their power by sharing these gifts with their men, displaying not kindness but the twisted abundance of conquest. Women were the currency that oiled the machine of loyalty. Without them, the feasts would lose their spectacle, the alliances their glue, the warriors their reward. The bride market wasn't just an auction. It was the spine of Viking social order. And if you think this is the bottom of the pit, think again. Because being handed to one man in a drunken marketplace was only the beginning of her humiliation. What followed was a ritual so obscene, it makes the market itself look almost civilized. It begins, not with silence, but with laughter. The cruel kind that echoes through the rafters of a hall reeking of mead and smoke. For the men, the feast has reached its peak. For the women, it is the moment of deepest dread, because now comes the ritual that Viking culture dressed as marriage, but in truth was something far more grotesque. Public humiliation disguised as ceremony. In most cultures, a bride is honored, veiled, celebrated as she takes her place at her husband's side. In the Viking hall, the opposite could be true. A war bride was paraded, mocked, and stripped of whatever shreds of dignity remained. Her body was not her own. It was a stage, a symbol, a warning. Every gesture screamed the same message: she was conquered property. The sagas and foreign accounts hint at scenes that feel more like theater than ritual, except the theater was cruel and the audience drunk with bloodlust. Sometimes the woman would be forced to sit at the feet of her new husband, like a slave crouched before a master. Sometimes she was dragged across the hall, jeered at, forced to drink from horns she did not want, to kiss men she did not choose, to perform acts that blurred the line between wedding rites and deliberate degradation. And the crowd cheered, because this was not just about one man claiming a bride. It was about a community affirming its dominance over another community. The humiliation was a public performance of power, an unspoken law that reminded everyone what we take, we own, and what we own, we break. Think of it like a medieval reality show, except the contestants weren't volunteers, and the stakes weren't prize money. They were dignity, freedom, and sometimes life itself. Every jeer, every mocking laugh was an audience vote, a chorus of approval for cruelty disguised as culture. To us, it reads like sadism, but to them, it was ritual order. To humiliate the bride wasn't an accident. It was necessary, because humiliation is a weapon sharper than any sword. To strip someone of their pride publicly is to kill them twice, once in body, once in spirit. And for the Vikings, who thrived on dominance, breaking the spirit was half the point. One can imagine the dread, standing before a room of roaring men, knowing every eye judged not your beauty or your worth, but how convincingly your fear would feed their triumph. Every stumble, every tear became entertainment. And if she resisted, resistance only fueled the mockery. The more she fought, the more she was broken. It wasn't just spectacle, it was pedagogy. These rituals taught the younger men what victory meant, drilled into their minds that conquest was not complete until humiliation was achieved. The wedding became a school of cruelty. Modern parallels creep in again, unsettlingly familiar. Public shaming, hazing rituals, humiliations turned into entertainment. We see echoes of this in everything from bullying caught on camera to toxic reality TV shows. The difference is scale. Today, humiliation ends in memes and clicks. For a Viking war bride, it ended in a life sentence. The cruelty deepened when sexual mockery entered the ritual. Foreign chroniclers describe instances where women were forced into obscene performances, taunted with suggestions, compelled to endure the humiliation of innuendo that carried the promise of worse to come. It wasn't just about making her a wife. It was about making her a warning. Her body became a billboard of what happened when you dared stand against the men who now drank above her. And the laughter always returned. That laughter is the most chilling detail, because it tells us that none of this was done in private, in shame or secrecy. It was celebrated, it was normalized, it was turned into theater. Imagine then the silence when the ritual ended. The bride left not in joy but in terror, not honored but utterly erased. And as the torches burned lower and the mead ran dry, she knew what everyone in that hall knew. The ritual was only the prelude, because humiliation was just the beginning. What came next would leave scars far deeper than mockery. What came next would turn the wedding into a nightmare no feast could drown out. And when it came, it happened in front of everyone. The feast grows quiet. The laughter, the boasts, the jeers, they fade into something more sinister. Because once the bride has been paraded, mocked, and broken, there remains one final ritual to seal her fate. And unlike the feast, unlike the auction, unlike the humiliation, this part was not always hidden. Sometimes it unfolded before the very eyes of the men who had just been cheering. In Viking culture, marriage was not considered complete until it was consummated. But for a war bride, this was not a private moment. It was a weaponized performance, a public proclamation of dominance. What should have been intimate was twisted into theater, a grotesque consummation designed to leave no doubt she was property now. Foreign chroniclers and sagas hint at these ceremonies with chilling matter-of-factness. A woman newly given to her captor could be dragged into a side room, or worse, forced to endure the act in full view of the hall. The men would watch, laugh, and drink as if it were another form of entertainment. Imagine the humiliation of being stripped not only of choice, but of privacy, your body turned into a stage on which male victory was acted out. It is hard to overstate the cruelty of this spectacle. It wasn't simply rape, it was rape converted into ritual, humiliation codified into custom. The bride's consent was irrelevant. Her screams were just part of the soundtrack. The louder she cried, the more it confirmed the man's dominance. The more the audience felt the intoxicating thrill of victory made flesh. For the Vikings, this was not aberration. It was affirmation. A woman's body was a battlefield, as surely as the muddy field outside the village. And just as the warriors carved their power into the earth with fire and blood, they carved it into their captives through acts meant not only to possess, but to display possession. Think of it like a medieval initiation rite, except the victim wasn't a willing initiate, but a prisoner, and the price wasn't humiliation alone. It was annihilation of self. The grotesque consummation was a ritual murder of dignity. Once performed, there was no going back. The woman's former life, her identity, her place in the world, it was gone. She was now marked forever as spoil, as property, as the conquered, and the cruelty extended beyond that night. Once branded in this way, a woman could never reclaim her former status, even if freed or traded. Her forced consummation made her untouchable to her old kin, an outcast in the very society she once belonged to. In one act, she lost not only freedom, but community, family, and home. Modern parallels are chilling. Wartime sexual violence has been documented from Bosnia to Rwanda, used again and again as a tool of terror, humiliation, and dominance. The Viking grotesque consummation was an early, open example of the same logic. Break the body and you break the soul of a people. A single act against one woman was a message to an entire village. An entire tribe resist us, and this will happen to all of you. Some sagas even describe women driven to suicide rather than endure what was coming. Others were forced into it publicly as part of grotesque displays that blurred the line between religious rite and sadistic entertainment. One account tells of a bride taken to a bed made the middle of a hall, surrounded by cheering men who toasted as if celebrating the slaughter of her spirit. And still, the laughter echoed. That detail returns again and again. It was never silent. The laughter told her, and everyone watching, that her suffering was not tragedy, but entertainment, not horror, but celebration. What must it have felt like? Knowing the walls of the hall held no escape, knowing every eye was turned on you not as a human, but as proof that conquest was complete. The consummation was not about sex. It was about spectacle, about ownership, about crushing resistance so completely that even intimacy became a weapon. And when it was over, when the crowd staggered home and the fires dimmed, she was left with nothing but the knowledge that her body had been turned into a public stage of humiliation. The feast had ended, but her captivity was just beginning. Because if you think her fate ended with one man's claim, you're wrong. For many of these women, the grotesque consummation was just the start of a longer, more insidious nightmare. They would soon discover that in Viking society, a bride was rarely a wife for long. She was a bargaining chip. The horror did not end once the hall fell silent. For many war brides, the nightmare was only just beginning. Because in Viking society, even after she had been paraded, mocked and claimed, a woman's fate was never secure. Her role as a bride was not about family, not about love, not even about stability. It was about leverage. To the Vikings, women taken in war were bargaining chips, tools to be traded, bartered and wielded like weapons in a game of politics and power. One day she might be forced into the bed of a warrior. The next, she could be handed over as part of a treaty, a peace deal, or a strategic alliance between clans. Her body was currency, her suffering an investment. And the cruelest part, this wasn't considered shameful. It was celebrated as shrewd diplomacy. Viking leaders treated women like pawns on a chessboard, moving them from one household to another, forging alliances not with ink and parchment, but with human flesh. A bride could be offered as a gesture of peace, her forced marriage binding two blood-soaked enemies into uneasy kinship. But for her, that peace was just another prison. The sagas tell us stories of women traded multiple times, passed along as easily as coins changing hands. Each transfer erased what little identity remained, reshaping her destiny according to the shifting tides of politics. Today, she might be the wife of a chieftain. Tomorrow, she could be packed off to cement the loyalty of a rival or to sweeten a business exchange. She was both hostage and bribe, and her body was the collateral. Think of the grotesque hypocrisy. Viking men loved to boast of honor, yet their version of honor included handing over women as tokens in their power games. They glorified kinship and family, yet they shattered those very bonds by turning marriages into acts of political theater. It is a contradiction so glaring, it feels almost satirical, like watching a man give a wedding toast about love and loyalty while treating his bride like a poker chip. And the cruelty deepened, because to be used as a bargaining chip meant living in constant uncertainty. A woman never knew if the man she was forced to call husband today would discard her tomorrow, sending her to strangers whose language she didn't speak, whose customs she didn't know, whose control she could not escape. She lived suspended in a limbo of captivity, where even despair offered no stability. The psychological torment is hard to grasp. Imagine waking every day knowing your fate could change with a drunken deal, a political whim, or a whispered betrayal. No home, no anchor, no hope of belonging. Every relationship around you is transactional. Every smile hides the possibility of another trade. Modern parallels sting uncomfortably. Even today, in conflict zones across the world, women are still used as bargaining tools, sold in marriages, traded to cement alliances, sacrificed for the ambitions of men who see them as nothing more than currency. The Viking Age was not unique. It was simply honest about what too many societies have always done. reducing women to pawns in games they never chose to play. And the sagas are silent on the voices of the women themselves. Their pain is footnoted, their resistance erased, their humanity swallowed up by the glorification of male politics. It is this silence that screams the loudest. We are left to imagine the despair, the broken hope, the quiet resignation of women who realized their entire lives had become collateral in an endless cycle of war and peace. And yet, sometimes silence gave way to screams. There are accounts of women who resisted, who cursed their captors, who refused to be silent pawns. Some were beaten for it, others killed. Their defiance was not recorded as bravery, but as inconvenience, a disruption to the delicate game of men. But the truth remains, in Viking society, a war bride was never secure, never free. She was a bargaining chip, and bargaining chips are meant to be spent. And if you think this was the lowest point, that being traded and bartered was the ultimate cruelty, wait until you hear what came next. Because for many women, captivity didn't end with politics. It descended into something even darker, years of slavery, chains and graves that tell a story more chilling than the sagas ever dared to write. Chains rattle softly in the dark. For many women, this was the sound that defined their new lives, the weight of iron biting against raw skin, a reminder that their marriage was no marriage at all. Because in Viking society, the line between wife and slave blurred until it disappeared. And that paradox, the slave wife, was perhaps the cruelest fate of all. On the surface, some war brides were dressed, fed, and paraded as wives. They shared the household of their captors, bore their children, and outwardly filled the role of partner. But beneath that fragile facade lay the truth. They were captives in chains, concubines forced into obedience, their bodies treated as breeding stock rather than companions. The sagas and archaeology confirm this dual existence. Excavated graves reveal women buried beside Viking men, laid out with jewelry, household items, even children at their side. At first glance, these graves look like tokens of honor, but a closer look tells a darker story. Some skeletons show signs of shackles, others bear trauma on the bones, injuries consistent with restraint and abuse. These weren't honored wives, they were possessions entombed alongside their masters, tokens of ownership carried beyond the grave. And here lies the paradox. A Viking man could claim a woman as his wife, and yet treat her no differently than the thrall who served his table. She was expected to labor, to obey, to submit. If she bore him sons, she was valuable. If she resisted, she was disposable. The word wife was a mask, a pretty veil hiding the cold truth of slavery. Imagine the daily life of such a woman. She wakes before dawn, not with the affection of a partner, but with the orders of a master. She carries water, grinds grain, weaves cloth, all under the gaze of men who view her not as human, but as captured property. At night, she is forced into the bed of the man who calls her his bride, her body demanded as part of the same labor as grinding flour or tending fires. There is no boundary, no sanctuary, no escape. The cruelty cuts deeper when you realize that Viking law permitted men to own multiple concubines, often taken in raids. A single hall could contain several wives, each one a slave by another name, each one fighting for scraps of survival in a hierarchy where even their children's fate depended on the whims of the master. Some children of these unions were acknowledged and raised, others were discarded, erased, denied their place in the family line. The paradox extended to them as well, born of the household yet never truly belonging to it. Modern parallels glare back at us here too. Think of modern trafficking victims forced into sham marriages, their captivity hidden under the legal pretense of union. The Viking world was an early template of this same deception. Call it marriage, but live it as slavery. Call it love, but enforce it with chains. And what about escape? For some, there was none. Runaways were hunted, beaten, or killed. A slave wife who fled was not a woman seeking freedom. She was a piece of property stolen, and the punishment was as brutal as if she were a missing piece of treasure. For others, escape meant death, choosing suicide over another night of captivity. And still their stories are silent in the chronicles, erased in favor of sagas that glorified the raiders who enslaved them. The hypocrisy is staggering. A culture that worshipped gods of fertility and family, that sang songs of honor and kinship, turned family itself into a prison for the women they captured. They spoke of Odin's wisdom and Freya's beauty, yet treated living women as cattle in their halls. The paradox of the slave wife was not an accident of history. It was a system, an institution designed to exploit, to humiliate, to perpetuate power. It is the kind of cruelty that hides behind ritual, pretending to be marriage when it was nothing more than bondage with a veil. And as horrifying as this is, it was not the final chapter of their suffering. Because some women weren't just enslaved in life, they were chosen for something even darker in death. Their final role was not wife, not slave, not even concubine. It was sacrifice. The hall falls silent, not with peace, but with anticipation. Because for some war brides, captivity did not end with slavery. It ended with death, not a quiet death in bed, not even the mercy of battle, but a staged execution dressed up as sacred ritual. The sacrificial bride was the final, most grotesque chapter of Viking cruelty. The most chilling account comes from Abd ibn Fadlan, the Arab envoy who traveled north and witnessed a Viking ship burial on the banks of the Volga. He describes it with the dispassionate tone of a man both horrified and duty-bound to record a chieftain had died, and with him his possessions were to be buried. But possessions meant more than weapons, more than treasure. It meant people, slaves. And in this case, one of them, a young woman, was chosen to die with her master. The process was methodical, almost theatrical. First, the woman was plied with drink, coaxed with promises that she would join her master in paradise. Witnesses cheered, sang, laughed, as if celebrating her fate. She was dressed in finery, adorned as though she were a bride on her wedding day, but everyone knew this was no wedding. It was a funeral, and she was the offering. Ibn Fadlan describes how the woman was paraded, passed from man to man, forced into sexual acts as part of the ritual. Each violation was framed as a gift, a send-off for her journey into the afterlife. Her body was not only humiliated, it was weaponized as the centerpiece of a spectacle meant to glorify her dead master. And then, when the hall had had its fill of debauchery, came the killing. 2 men seized her, and an old woman known as the Angel of Death held a rope around her neck. As the men pulled, she stabbed the girl with a blade again and again until the life drained out of her. Her screams mixed with the roar of the crowd, and when it was over, she was laid beside her master on the ship. The pyre was lit, flames consuming her body along with his, the final proof of ownership carried into the next world. Think about the grotesque hypocrisy of this scene. The Vikings claimed this was an honor, that she was chosen, celebrated, even blessed. But peel back the ritual, and what do you see? A terrified woman drugged, raped, strangled, and stabbed in front of an audience of men who disguised cruelty as piety. It wasn't honor. It was theater, a final act of domination, dressed up as religion. The sacrificial bride was a grotesque inversion of every cultural value we associate with marriage. Where most societies saw a bride as a new beginning, the Vikings turned her into an ending. Where marriage symbolized life and continuity, their ritual transformed it into death and destruction. Her body became not just property, not just currency, but fuel for fire. And disturbingly, this was not an isolated account. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia reveal graves where women's remains lie beside men, often showing signs of violent death. Some were decapitated, others bore marks of strangulation. These were not peaceful burials. They were sacrifices, women forced to follow men into death, their autonomy extinguished in service of a grotesque afterlife myth. The echoes reach uncomfortably close to us today. Across history, women have been sacrificed for men's glory in wars, in rituals, in honor killings that still stain headlines. The Viking sacrificial bride was simply one of the earliest, most naked examples of this pattern. When men seek to immortalize themselves, it is often women's bodies that are burned on the pyre. And here lies the ultimate horror. The sacrificial bride wasn't just killed, she was erased. Her story wasn't told in her own words. It came through the voices of men who laughed, cheered, and justified her suffering. As noble, even her death was stolen from her, repackaged as theater for those who watched. The fire consumed her. The hall roared. The saga of the dead man lived on. And she became a footnote, a shadow, a victim of history's silence. But what the Vikings did to their sacrificial brides reveals a truth too monstrous to ignore. For them, conquest didn't end with life. It extended into death itself. And if you thought this was the final cruelty, if you thought being burned alive beside your master was the deepest abyss, there is still one more revelation waiting, a truth about Viking culture that ties all of these horrors together and leaves us with a question that echoes even now. What does it mean when a society builds its power on the destruction of women?